Greetings, traveler. Are you lost? The woods have a way of leading you astray, but fear not, for I have a tale to tell you. Stay close to the fire, for the shadows beyond have eyes of their own. For most children, bedtime is a comforting end to a long day, a chance to rest and recharge. For me, however, it was a nightly descent into terror. While others might grumble about being sent to bed before finishing a movie or their favorite game, my nights were shrouded in fear. Even now, part of me can't completely shake that dread. As someone grounded in science, I can't offer concrete proof that what I experienced was objectively real, but I can assure you that the fear I felt was deeply authentic and matched by anything else I've faced in my life. I'm sharing my story with you now, not to convince you of its reality, but simply to unburden myself. What you choose to believe is up to you. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it began, but my unease about falling asleep seemed to coincide with moving into my own room. At 9 years old, I had happily shared a room with my older brother up until then. Being 6 years older, he understandably wanted his own space, and so I was given the room at the back of the house. The room was small, narrow, and unusually long, just big enough for a bed and a couple of drawers, with little room for anything else. I couldn't bring myself to complain. Even at that young age, I understood we lived in a modest home, and there was no real reason to feel let down. My family was warm and loving, and my days were filled with happiness. The room had a single window that faced our backyard. It was nothing remarkable, yet the daylight that filtered in always felt subdued, as if reluctant to fully brighten the space. When my brother got a new bed, I inherited the old bunk airbeds we had once shared. While I was uneasy about sleeping alone, I couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement at the idea of claiming the top bunk. It felt like an adventure waiting to happen. From the very first night, a peculiar sense of unease began to creep into my thoughts, lingering at the edges of my mind. I lay on the top bunk, gazing down at the scattered action figures and toy cars spread across the greenish-blue carpet. As my imagination brought the toys to life in epic battles and daring adventures, I felt an odd pull. My gaze kept drifting toward the bottom bunk. It was as though something just out of sight was stirring there, something that didn't want to be noticed. The bottom bunk was empty, its dark blue blanket neatly tucked in place, partially concealing two plain white pillows. As a child, I didn't give it a second thought. The comforting hum of my parents' television, drifting under the door, filled me with a reassuring sense of safety. I drifted off to sleep. When you're jolted awake by the sensation of something shifting or stirring nearby, it often takes a moment to fully grasp what's happening. The haze of sleep lingers, clouding your senses, even as awareness begins to return. There was no mistaking it. Something was moving. At first I couldn't tell what it was. The room was nearly pitch black, but the faint glow from outside offered just enough light to trace the narrow, confining space around me. Two thoughts struck me at almost the same time. First, my parents must already be asleep, as the rest of the house was cloaked in stillness and shadow. Second, I focused on the sound that had undoubtedly pulled me from my sleep. That was it, the unmistakable sound of bedsheets shifting in the darkness, as though someone below me was restlessly trying to settle into the bottom bunk. I lay still, unsure whether it was a trick of my imagination, or perhaps just my pet cat curling up for the night. But then I noticed my door closed, exactly as it had been when I drifted off to sleep. Perhaps my mom had come to check on me, and the cat had slipped into the room unnoticed. Yes, that had to be it. I rolled over to face the wall, shutting my eyes in a futile attempt to drift back to sleep. But as I moved, the rustling beneath me stopped. At first I thought I had startled the cat, but it didn't take long to realize that whatever was in the bottom bunk wasn't my pet seeking a place to rest. It was something far more unsettling. It was as though my presence had been sensed and irritated, for the restless sleeper suddenly began thrashing about in bed, their movements wild and erratic, reminiscent of a child throwing a fit. The rustling of the sheets grew louder and more intense, A wave of fear washed over me, not the lingering discomfort I had felt before, but a surge of raw terror. My heartbeat quickened, and my eyes darted around, desperately trying to make sense of the suffocating darkness that surrounded me. Like most young boys, I instinctively called for my mother. I could hear movement from the other side of the house, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that my parents were rushing to my rescue. But then, the bunk bed lurched violently, as though struck by an earthquake, scraping harshly against the wall. The sheets beneath me seemed to writhe with malevolent energy. I couldn't bring myself to jump down, terrified that whatever lurked beneath would reach up and pull me into the dark. So, I remained frozen, my hands gripping the blanket tightly, as though it could shield me. The weight stretched on, feeling endless. At last, the door flew open, and I was flooded with light, my body drenched in its warmth. Meanwhile, the bottom bunk, once home to my unwelcome guest, sat undisturbed, calm, and empty. I wept, and my mother comforted me. Tears of fear mingled with relief as they streaked down my cheeks. But amid all the emotions, I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. There was something inside me that prevented me from speaking about it, as if merely mentioning it might summon whatever had occupied the bottom bunk. Whether that was true or not, I couldn't say, but as a child, I felt an eerie sense that the presence was still nearby, lurking, listening. My mother settled into the vacant bunk, vowing to stay until morning. Gradually, my anxiety eased, and exhaustion began to pull me toward sleep. However, I remained uneasy, stirring awake several times to the faint sound of sheets rustling. I recall the next day feeling an intense urge to escape that stifling, cramped room, to be anywhere else. It was a Saturday, and I spent the day happily playing outside with my friends. Though our house wasn't spacious, we were fortunate to have a long, sloping backyard. It was often our playground, with its wild overgrowth providing perfect spots to hide, and a towering sycamore tree that begged to be climbed. In that untamed space, it was easy to lose ourselves in grand adventures, imagining we were explorers in a distant, exotic land. Despite all the fun, my gaze would sometimes drift to that small, unassuming window, plain and harmless to anyone else. But to me, it was a portal to a chilling pocket of unease. Beyond it, the vibrant greenery of our garden and the cheerful laughter of my friends couldn't silence the creeping dread that climbed my spine, prickling every hair. It felt as though something lingered in that room, silently watching me, biding its time until nightfall, when I'd be alone, brimming with a malevolent, hateful presence. It might sound odd, but when my parents sent me back to that room for the night, I didn't argue. I didn't complain or offer any excuse to avoid it. Instead, I quietly walked in, climbed the steps to the top bunk, and waited. Now, as an adult, I'd eagerly share such an experience with anyone willing to listen. But even at that young age, I felt foolish bringing up something I had no real proof of. Still, I'd be lying if I said that was the main reason for my silence. Deep down, I was convinced that whatever it was would be furious if I dared to speak of it. It's strange how certain words can stay buried in your mind, no matter how obvious they might seem. On that second night, as I lay there alone in the dark, scared and acutely aware of a foul shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness in the air, as though something unseen had pushed its way in, one such word surfaced. As I heard the faint, casual rustling of sheets from the bunk below, my heartbeat quickened, and the chilling realization struck. Something was there again. That word, long exiled and suppressed, clawed its way to the forefront of my thoughts, breaking free, gasping for recognition, and searing itself into my consciousness. Ghost. As this thought crossed my mind, I realized my unwelcome guest had stopped moving. The rustling of the sheets had been replaced by something far more horrifying, a slow, rhythmic, rasping breath that filled the room. I could almost picture its chest rising and falling with each strained, grotesque exhale. A shiver ran through me as I silently pleaded for it to leave without anything further happening. The house was shrouded in the same oppressive darkness as the night before. An eerie silence enveloped everything, broken only by the distorted, labored breathing of my unseen companion below. Paralyzed with fear, I lay there, desperate for it to leave me in peace. What did it want from me? Then something unmistakably horrifying happened. It moved. This movement wasn't like the restless, chaotic thrashing from before, which felt wild and aimless, almost animal-like. No, this was deliberate, calculated, and disturbingly purposeful. Whatever lay in the darkness beneath me, intent on tormenting a young boy, had calmly and deliberately sat up. Its heavy, rasping breaths grew louder, now separated from me by nothing more than a thin mattress and a few fragile wooden slats. I lay there, tears welling in my eyes, consumed by a fear so profound that words could never fully convey it. I didn't think such terror could intensify, but I was wrong. My mind conjured an image of the thing below, sitting silently, leaning in close, straining to detect any sign that I was awake. Then, imagination gave way to a chilling reality. I felt it. Movement below. It began to touch the wooden slats supporting my mattress, running what I could only assume were fingers and hands across the surface, slowly, almost as if savoring the moment. Suddenly, with startling force, it jabbed angrily between two slats, pressing into the mattress. Even through the padding, it felt like sharp fingers had been thrust brutally into my side. I let out a piercing scream, and the thing beneath me responded with a violent fury. The bunk shook uncontrollably, just as it had the previous night, causing the frame to scrape harshly against the wall. Tiny flakes of paint rained down onto my blanket as the bed groaned and rattled, moving back and forth in a frenzy. Once again, the room was flooded with light, and there stood my mother, loving and compassionate as ever. She wrapped me in a reassuring hug, her soothing words gradually calming my panic. Naturally, she asked what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. I didn't dare. Instead, I repeated a single word, again and again. Nightmare. This cycle repeated itself for weeks, perhaps even months. Night after night, I would wake to the unsettling sound of rustling sheets below me. Each time, I would scream immediately, desperate to prevent the creature from having a chance to prod or search for me. My cries were always met with the violent shaking of the bed, a chaotic frenzy that only ceased when my mother arrived. She would spend the remainder of the night in the bottom bunk, seemingly oblivious to the dark presence tormenting her son. From time to time, I managed to fake being sick or invent other excuses to sleep in my parents' bed. But more often than not, I found myself alone for those first few hours each night in that room, a place where the light from outside never seemed quite right. Alone, with that presence lurking in the dark. Over time, you can grow numb to almost anything, no matter how terrifying. I eventually came to understand that, for some reason, this presence couldn't harm me when my mother was nearby. I imagine the same would have been true for my father. But as kind and loving as he was, rousing him from sleep was nearly impossible. After several months, I had become somewhat accustomed to the presence that visited me each night. But don't mistake this for some strange bond. I loathed the creature. My fear remained, as I could almost feel its intentions, its essence, if you could even call it that. It was filled with a grotesque, twisted hatred, yet it seemed to crave my presence. Of all things, my deepest fears came to fruition during the winter months. The days grew shorter, and the extended nights offered the creature more chances to torment me. It was a hard time for our family. My grandmother, a kind and gentle soul, had rapidly declined since the passing of my grandfather. My mother did everything she could to keep her involved in the community. But dementia is a ruthless, progressive illness that slowly erases a person's memories. Eventually, she no longer recognized any of us, and it became evident that she would have to be moved from her home to a nursing facility. Before my grandmother could be relocated, she had a particularly rough few nights, and my mother decided to stay with her. As much as I loved my grandmother, and felt heartbroken over her illness. I still feel guilty that my first thoughts weren't of her well-being, but of the terror that might unfold if my nightly visitor realized my mother was gone. Her presence had always been the one thing I was certain kept the full extent of the creature's menace at bay. That day, I hurried home from school and wasted no time tearing the bed sheets and mattress off the lower bunk. I pulled out all the slats and replaced them with an old desk, a chest of drawers, and a few chairs from the cupboard, filling the space where the bottom bunk had been. When I told my father I was setting up an office, he found it charming. But there was no way I was going to let that thing have a place to rest for another night. As nightfall approached, I lay there, acutely aware that my mother was not home. I didn't know what to do. My only instinct was to quietly take a small family crucifix from her jewelry box, one I had seen before. While my family wasn't particularly religious, I still believed in God at that age and clung to the hope that it would somehow shield me. Gripped with fear and anxiety, I held the crucifix tightly under my pillow as I tried to sleep. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, praying that I would wake up in the morning without any trouble. Unfortunately, that night turned out to be the most terrifying one yet. I woke slowly, the room engulfed in darkness once again. As my eyes adjusted, I began to make out the outlines of the window, the door, the walls, and some toys on a shelf. But what struck me the most, what still makes me shudder today, was the silence. There was no rustling of sheets, no movement whatsoever. The room felt unnaturally still, lifeless even, yet undeniably not empty. The nightly visitor, that dreadful, wheezing, hate-filled presence that had tormented me so many times, wasn't in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. Fear had stolen my voice. I lay there, frozen, terrified that if I moved or made a sound, it would know I was awake. I couldn't see it yet, but I could feel it. It was hidden beneath my blanket. I could sense its shape, its weight pressing down on me, but I dared not look. The sensation was unbearable, one that will haunt me forever. Hours seemed to stretch on as I lay motionless, consumed by the darkness. In that moment, I was nothing more than a frightened child, trapped in the grip of terror. Had it been summer, the light would have come by now, but winter's long, cold grasp held the night in place. I knew it would be hours before dawn, and I longed for it with every fiber of my being. I had always been a timid child, but I reached a breaking point when I could wait no longer. When I couldn't endure the presence of this sinister thing any longer. Fear, over time, can wear you down, leaving you drained, a mere shell of yourself. I had to get out of that bed. Then, I remembered the crucifix. My hand was still beneath the pillow, but it was empty. I slowly searched around, trying to make as little sound as possible, but it was gone. I must have knocked it off the top bunk, or worse, it had been taken from me. I couldn't bring myself to think about it any further. Without the crucifix, all hope seemed to drain from me. Even at such a young age, I understood what death meant, and the fear of it was overwhelming. I knew, deep down, that if I stayed still in that bed, passive and dormant, I wouldn't survive the night. I had to escape, but how? Should I leap from the bed and risk running for the door, praying it wouldn't be faster than me? Or should I try to sneak off the top bunk without disturbing the strange presence beside me? Then, I realized that, when I moved to search for the crucifix, it hadn't reacted at all. This sparked a strange thought. What if it was asleep? It hadn't made a sound, not even a breath, since I woke up. Maybe it was resting, thinking it had finally caught me. Perhaps it believed I was now within its grasp. Or maybe it was playing with me, just like it had done night after night, with me trapped beneath it, powerless, and with no mother to protect me. Maybe it was biding its time, savoring the moment of victory, like a predator relishing its kill. I tried to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. Gathering every shred of courage I had, I reached out with my right hand, slowly pulling the blanket off of me. What I felt under the covers nearly stopped my heart. I couldn't see it, but as my hand moved the blanket, it brushed against something smooth and cold, something that unmistakably felt like a skeletal hand. I held my breath, convinced that it must have realized I was awake, but nothing happened. It didn't move. It felt lifeless. After a few moments, I carefully slid my hand further down the blanket, and my fingers brushed against a thin, underdeveloped forearm. A strange sense of confidence mixed with a twisted curiosity grew in me as I moved downward, discovering a disproportionately large bicep. The arm was outstretched, resting across my chest, with a hand lying on my left shoulder, as if it had gripped me while I slept. I knew then that if I had any hope of escaping, I would have to move this decaying limb. Something about the ragged, torn fabric on its shoulder made me pause. A surge of fear shot through me, and I quickly recoiled my hand, repulsed by the greasy strands of hair I had touched. I couldn't bring myself to touch its face, though to this day, I still wonder what it would have felt like. And then, it moved. It moved. It was subtle at first, but I could feel its grip on my shoulder and body tighten. I couldn't bring myself to cry, though every part of me longed to. As its hand and arm slowly coiled around me, my right leg brushed against the cold wall next to the bed. Of everything that had happened in that room, this was the strangest realization. This foul, grasping thing that took such pleasure in tormenting me was not entirely on top of me. It was reaching out from the wall, like a spider waiting to strike. Then, its grip shifted from a slow tightening to a sudden, desperate squeeze. It clawed at my clothes, as though it feared the chance would slip away. I struggled, but its withered arm was too strong. I felt its head rise up, writhing and twisting beneath the blanket. I finally understood. It was trying to pull me into the wall. I fought with everything I had, screaming, but no one came. And then I understood why it was so desperate, why it had to have me now. Through the window, that same window that had always felt so menacing, the first rays of sunlight began to streak in. I fought harder, knowing that if I could just hold on a little longer, the nightmare would soon be over. As I struggled, the creature slowly crawled up my chest, its head emerging from the blanket, wheezing, coughing, rasping. I don't remember its face, but I'll never forget the cold, foul breath that brushed against my face, as icy as death itself. As the sun rose over the horizon, the suffocating dark room that had been filled with dread was bathed in sunlight. I lost consciousness as its thin fingers tightened around my neck, choking the life from me. When I woke up, my father was offering to make me breakfast, such a comforting sight. I had survived the most terrifying experience of my life. I pushed the bed away from the wall, leaving behind the furniture I had believed would keep the creature from claiming the bunk. I never imagined it would try to claim both the bed and me. Weeks went by without incident, but one cold, frosty night, I awoke to the violent rattling of the furniture where the bunk beds once stood. For a moment, the noise stopped, and I thought I could hear a distant wheeze coming from deep within the wall, gradually fading away. I've never told anyone this story before. To this day, the sound of rustling sheets at night, or the wheeze from a common cold, makes me break out in a cold sweat. And I never, ever sleep with my bed against a wall. Call it superstition if you like. But while I can't rule out explanations like sleep paralysis, hallucinations, or an overactive imagination, there's one thing I do know. The following year, I was given a larger room on the other side of the house, and my parents took this strange, stifling room as their bedroom. They said they didn't need much space, just enough for a bed and a few things. They lasted 10 days. On the 11th day, we moved. Thank you for listening, but before you go, take a moment, catch your breath. The second part of this story is coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Hit that notification bell so you won't be left in the dark when the next chapter drops. Rest well, but remember, some things are never fully gone. Sleep tight.